presiding in the court. And I think it's also important to point out that there's very few Canadian organizations that are listed. There's Samidoun now and Irfan and some far-right organizations that ostensibly are based out of Canada, even though there's question about whether or not how performative that action was or substantial in terms of their activity in Canada. But the vast majority are not in Canada. And so it renders it even more difficult, if not impossible, for them to challenge their listing because they're not even part of the process and may not have access to being able to or be aware of the process for getting judicial review and filing a challenge. And it would also be very difficult for them to even be present in Canada, given that if they're a listed terrorist entity, they or their representatives would be barred from entering the country. And it also raises an important point about how historically the list has been used. So if we look at the organizations that are on the list, the vast majority are those that would be linked to what's called and so-called Islamic terrorism. And a disproportionate amount are actually organizations that the government would link directly to Palestine and Palestinian liberation. I think the percentage is about 14% of the organizations listed on the terrorist entities list are in one way or another linked to Palestinian liberation, and whereas they represent a much Palestinians represent a very small proportion of the world population, and present an even smaller proportion of active organizations in Canada. And so this is being used to try to demonstrate, and has been used to justify this idea that the biggest threat to Canadians is so-called Islamic terrorism. Whereas we know that in the last 10 years, the biggest threat of violence, and that's led to the most deaths in Canada, and the largest threat has been from far-right extremists. And even though we have seen some of those organizations added to the terrorist entities list, that actually, from our research, hasn't really translated into a greater focus overall on that issue and that threat, but rather that it was a way to signal there was a concern, but to simply put them on the list and do very little to then follow up and address the issue. And so it's being used as a political tool, and we've seen the government and other governments that have these kinds of lists used as a way to deflect from the violence of the state and problems with government foreign policy, and in order to justify a discriminatory and stigmatizing approach to what's considered a national security threat to Canada. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is also the chilling effect, as Yavar mentioned, and I think that was a really good point that you raised around how that the concern isn't so much around criminal prosecution. The risk is there, but we see this a lot around accusations of involvement in terrorism. So, for example, we've done a lot of research and work on how Muslim charities in general in Canada face greater scrutiny and accusations of being linked to financing of terrorism. Not once has there actually been a criminal charge laid of terrorist financing against anyone involved with a Muslim charity in Canada, but rather it's used to cause a chilling effect across the sector in order to try to limit and influence the kinds of works that charities are able to do, and to further Canada's foreign policy goals and the foreign policy goals of its partners, because as we know, some of these audits and the work of the CRA, as Yavar noted, and as we've seen in other cases, have been influenced by Israel and by other countries in terms of secret intelligence that's unfounded and untested. And I think I'd like to just close up by kind of putting this in a bigger context. So we're talking about the terrorist entities list, but that's just one of the administrative tools that the government uses to try to combat terrorism, and that has these kinds of effects. So we also see it with the no-fly list, the Passenger Protect program, where people are placed on a no-fly list in secret. So it's actually even more, there's another layer to this one where without going to court, without laying charges, an individual is placed in secret on a list, limiting their ability to board an airplane. And they're only informed of the fact that they're on this list if they're actually barred from boarding, but they can be subject to a whole slew of other security measures, including interrogation, secondary screening, delays at the border, and things like that. Often it can result in people trying to return to Canada, then being delayed or being subject to the no-fly list, not being able to return to the country, or having to take a roundabout route in order to return to the country. And again, it's a system where once you are on the list, it's incredibly, and you know that you're on the list, it's incredibly hard to challenge your listing because, again, the information used to place you on that list is considered sensitive national security information and is withheld. And that leads me to the last thing I want to touch on around how this information is used in the courts and the changes with Bill C-70, the Countering Foreign Interference Act. And that's that. Along with the no-fly list, there are several other pieces of legislation that have these kinds of administrative regimes for countering terrorism. So that includes a new authorization regime for humanitarian organizations and international cooperation organizations that want to operate in an area that is controlled by a terrorist entity. So since last year, they have to apply for an authorization in order to carry out work for it. And the biggest example is in Afghanistan. There's also the Charities Registration Security Information Act, which allows for a certificate to be issued against a charity if the government believes that they're involved in terrorism or could be involved in terrorism. And what they do is they set up a system where there's these administrative proceedings, and where each of them had kind of an ad hoc system of limiting what kind of judges. Well, sorry, first of all, the Attorney General being able to say that information cannot be disclosed in court, the judge then having to review whether or not the information cannot be disclosed, and who's allowed to then have access to those proceedings around the discussion of disclosure, and if the information can't be disclosed publicly, what information is still going to be considered among that secret information in making a decision. And they were all kind of had different aspects that were similar, but also differences. And so under Bill C-70, they created what they're now calling the Secure Administrative Review Proceeding to essentially universalize the process. It's going to standardize the process through all these different regimes. And on one hand, it gives a predictability to the system. But on the other hand, it creates essentially the normalization of the acceptance that when people are challenging these listings in court, listings that have an intense impact on their lives and on their livelihoods, that it's simple to institute a system where they can't have access to the information being used against them, and that they need to rely on the discretion of a judge, of a special advocate who isn't representing them but can hear information in secret, and of the government to be able to essentially represent their interests when none of them are actually there to represent the person or the organization's interests. And so our concern is that this means that it will be very easy going forward for the government to bring in new systems like the terrorist entities list and no-fly list and others based on this idea that, well, now we have a standardized process for keeping this information secret. We don't have to worry about it getting out, so it makes it much easier to create a new system where this secret evidence is used. So that was a lot. I'll kind of end it there. There's a lot more that I think we could talk about, especially I think around the chilling effect on freedom of expression and what this means for the wider movement in support of Palestinian human rights and against the ongoing genocide. And hopefully in the question period we can get more into the. But yeah, thanks so much.